Wolverine, Weapon X thought they had struck gold. For years, their experiments aimed at building the perfect soldier had ended in corpses. But with Logan, they pulled off the impossible. His skeleton was bonded with adamantium, making his bones unbreakable and his claws into weapons deadlier than anything they could manufacture. By the time the procedure was finished, Weapon X had a living tank on their hands. In terms of pure science, it was a triumph. The problem, though, was the man inside it. Logan never submitted to their brainwashing, no matter how many times they wiped his memories or rewrote his past. Every attempt at programming left cracks, and through those cracks his willpower pushed back harder. The more they tried to bury his identity, the more dangerous he became when he surfaced. That danger boiled over one night inside the facility. Logan broke loose in a frenzy of claws and fury, ripping through soldiers, guards, and scientists until the walls themselves carried the scars of his escape. It wasn't the procedure that failed. Weapon X had succeeded in creating exactly what they wanted. What failed was their control. They couldn't leash him, couldn't bend him, into a weapon that stayed in their hands. Their greatest success in engineering turned into their greatest disaster in practice. Logan survived, but not as their soldier. He survived as their enemy. Every memory implant they tried later, every handler they assigned, every trigger phrase designed to control him, all of it unraveled in time. Instead of an asset, they forged a legend who exposed their secrets and fought against everything they stood for. Sabretooth. If Wolverine was the crown jewel of Weapon X, then Sabretooth was their guard dog. The program boosted his already formidable abilities: heightened senses, feral strength, rapid healing, and an animalistic durability that made him nearly unstoppable in close combat. On paper, the results looked impressive. He was a predator sharpened even further, designed to be unleashed on command. But the leash never held. From the start, Victor Creed's violent instincts outweighed any programming Weapon X attempted. Where Wolverine fought against conditioning with sheer will, Sabretooth's failure came from the other side. He reveled in violence so much that he was uncontrollable. He killed when ordered, but also when bored, when provoked, or simply when he felt like it. There was no discipline, no chain of command that could keep him in line. Weapon X wanted a soldier. What they got was a sadist who enjoyed the pain of others as much as the fight itself. Missions where he was deployed often ended in bloodbaths that went far beyond their objectives. Instead of precise operations, he left trails of corpses, drawing attention when the program wanted shadows. In the long term, this exposed how reckless their approach to weaponizing mutants had become. Sabretooth's failure is clear. The enhancements worked, the creation was a success, but the subject never functioned as the obedient weapon they needed. His bloodlust and lack of loyalty meant Weapon X could never truly rely on him. More often than not, he was just as dangerous to allies and handlers as he was to enemies. Deadpool. Weapon X wanted to copy their biggest success. Wolverine's healing factor had proven unbreakable, so they grafted a version of it into Wade Wilson, a terminal cancer patient with a sharp tongue and nothing left to lose. On the operating table, the procedure worked. Wade's body regenerated at impossible speed, repairing burns, bullets, and even the ravages of his cancer. In terms of biology, Weapon X had engineered another indestructible soldier. But the cost of that success became the failure. The healing factor kept his cells in constant chaos, leaving Wade disfigured with scarred skin and unstable brain chemistry. The man who walked out of their labs wasn't a soldier. They had created a mercenary with fractured sanity and no respect for authority. Weapon X had built something that couldn't be killed, but it also couldn't be controlled. Every mission proved the same story. Wade followed orders when they amused him and tore them apart when they didn't. He cracked jokes during firefights, mocked his own handlers, and turned classified assignments into personal comedy sketches. Instead of a weapon they could point, they had unleashed a force of chaos that laughed in their faces while burning down their plans. This was a failure born from psychology. The science gave him exactly what they asked for, a body that refused to die, but his mind was shredded in the process. Rather than loyalty, they bred rebellion. Rather than discipline, they fostered unpredictability. Wade became Deadpool, and the program couldn't decide if they'd built a nightmare, a liability, or both. X-23. Using stolen genetic material, Weapon X cloned Logan's DNA and created a female child they called X-23, later known as Laura Kinney. From a purely scientific perspective, the project worked. Laura had the claws, the healing factor, the durability, every advantage that made Wolverine a nightmare on the battlefield. For the first time, the program had proof they could replicate their greatest creation. The control measures were where things collapsed. From childhood, Laura was raised in a sterile lab, conditioned as a tool rather than a person. To guarantee obedience, the scientists designed a chemical identical trigger scent. Whenever Laura was exposed to it, she entered a killing frenzy, unable to distinguish friend from foe. On paper, this was their ultimate safeguard. In practice, it destroyed her stability. She slaughtered handlers, allies, and even her own surrogate mother once the trigger was deployed against her. Every mission carried the risk of self-inflicted disaster. By her teenage years, Laura had already outgrown their leash. She understood her conditioning, recognized the cruelty of her keepers, and began resisting the very control mechanisms meant to contain her. Instead of a loyal soldier, they had raised a traumatized assassin who would eventually escape and carve out her own identity. This is where the failure lies. The creation was flawless. Laura's abilities rivaled and even surpassed Wolverine's in some respects, but the program's obsession with control backfired. The very system designed to ensure her obedience shattered her trust and pushed her further away. In trying to perfect their weapon, they guaranteed it would slip through their fingers. Copycat. Weapon X didn't always need to build their weapons in a lab. Sometimes they recruited them. Vanessa Carlyle, better known as Copycat, was one of those acquisitions. As a mutant shapeshifter, she was the dream of any covert program. She could copy not just appearances, but down to the cellular level. Fingerprints, voices, even mutant powers in some cases. On paper, she was the perfect infiltrator. No serum, no bonding tank, no cybernetic implants required. The problem was never her abilities. Those worked flawlessly. The issue was Vanessa herself. Copycat had always been a mercenary at heart, working for whoever paid or aligned with her in the moment. Weapon X believed they could fold her into their structure, keep her trained, and point her at their enemies like a scalpel. What they got instead was a volatile agent whose loyalties shifted as easily as her appearance. Her missions rarely collapsed because of technical shortcomings. They collapsed because Copycat was unreliable. Sometimes she followed orders. Other times, she flipped allegiances mid-operation. She worked undercover for the program, but she also broke free, ran with Deadpool, and later tangled with X-Force. For Weapon X, this was exposure. A shapeshifter with access to sensitive intelligence who didn't stay bought was a liability they could never contain. This kind of failure was different from Wolverine or X-23. Those were lab creations that turned on their makers. With Copycat, the science was never the problem. Weapon X had gambled on recruitment, believing they could twist her into a permanent asset. Instead, they learned the hard way that skill without loyalty is worthless. Shiva. Weapon X had a problem. Their creations kept slipping out of their hands and none caused them more headaches than Wolverine. So they built Shiva, a massive cyborg specifically programmed for one purpose: track down and eliminate runaway experiments. This wasn't a general-purpose soldier. It wasn't meant for infiltration or espionage. Shiva was a single-minded hunter, armed with heavy weaponry and designed to adapt in battle. Its entire existence revolved around erasing mistakes. On the surface, the idea made sense. If Weapon X couldn't guarantee loyalty, they could at least guarantee retribution. The project churned out a towering machine equipped with strength, armor, and combat data pulled from Wolverine himself. Whenever a rogue agent posed a threat, Shiva could be unleashed like a living failsafe. The flaw showed immediately in practice. Shiva was relentless but not effective. Every time it was deployed, the cyborg was dismantled, destroyed, or otherwise neutralized. Even with all its programming and upgrades, it couldn't take down the very target it was designed for. Wolverine cut through it repeatedly, turning their solution into a recurring embarrassment. And unlike their mutant experiments, the machine performed exactly as intended, but the missions always failed. A hunter that never bagged its prey isn't an asset, it's wasted metal. Worse, each defeat chipped away at Weapon X's credibility. If their tailor-made killer couldn't handle a single mutant, then what did that say about the entire program? Shiva's legacy is one of futility. The science created a powerful enforcer, but the results in the field proved meaningless. It became a revolving door of destruction. Built up, sent out, destroyed again. In the end, the project represented a different kind of failure for Weapon X, a weapon that simply never delivered when it mattered most. Wildside. Already born with heightened senses, sharp claws, and animal-like agility, he seemed like another candidate who could be sharpened into a deadly operative. The program pushed him through their conditioning and experimentation, amplifying his natural gifts. On paper, they succeeded. He was faster, stronger, and more dangerous than before. The breakdown came not in the body, but in the mind. Wildchild's mental state was unstable long before Weapon X intervened, and the program only deepened the fracture. Instead of curing his volatility, they leaned on it, hoping aggression could be weaponized. What they ended up with was a subject too erratic to deploy reliably. His violent outbursts made him as much a liability to his handlers as to his enemies. Missions involving Wildchild rarely went the way Weapon X intended. Orders blurred into chaos the moment combat began. His heightened senses and animal drive turned every engagement into a frenzy that ignored strategy. The program wanted a controlled predator, but what they had was a creature driven by instinct, impossible to predict. More than once, his actions compromised objectives, making him unusable in the long run. This is a different shade of failure than with Wolverine or Deadpool. The enhancements worked, but the subject's psychology unraveled the usefulness of the creation. Wildchild embodied the flaw of assuming physical improvements alone could outweigh instability. Instead of a soldier, Weapon X had produced an uncontrollable savage who drifted into other villain groups once their grip loosened. Cyber. Weapon X always craved durability. They wanted a subject who could stand toe-to-toe with Wolverine and come out without a scratch. That dream led them to Silas Burr, a sadistic enforcer who already had a reputation for brutality. Through Weapon X's work, Burr was transformed into Cyber. His entire body was covered in adamantium skin, making him nearly impervious to physical harm. To anyone watching, it looked like the program had created the ultimate juggernaut, strong, unbreakable, and terrifying in appearance. The failure wasn't in the science. Cyber's enhancements worked exactly as intended. The problem was Burr himself. Long before the experiments, he was already a violent, unstable man, and the program only amplified those traits, instead of an indestructible soldier who could. Follow orders, Cyber became a drug-addicted, psychotic brute who acted according to his own sadistic impulses. Weapon X gave him near invulnerability, but they couldn't impose discipline. Every attempt to direct him collapsed under his own vices. He leaned on hallucinogens, fueled paranoia, and often lashed out without cause. Rather than serving as a controlled weapon, he became a walking disaster, someone the program could neither deploy with confidence nor keep contained. For Weapon X, this wasn't an escape like Wolverine, or an uncontrollable berserker like Sabretooth. This was a case where the enhancements were flawless, but the subject's psychology and addiction stripped away all strategic value. His presence became more of a cautionary story than an asset. His indestructibility made him hard to eliminate, but his unpredictability made him impossible to trust. In the end, Weapon X had succeeded in creating a nearly invulnerable body, yet failed completely at producing a functional soldier. Wildside. Weapon X's history is filled with test subjects who were supposed to be controllable soldiers, but turned out to be nightmares. With Wildside, the program thought they had found a specialist who could be turned into a psychological weapon. Richard Gill had the mutant ability to warp perception, creating vivid hallucinations in the minds of his targets. In theory, that meant Weapon X could use him to destabilize enemies, turn allies against each other, and clear the way for their operations. On the technical level, his powers worked exactly as expected. Under stress, Wildside could send entire groups into panic, making them believe they were surrounded or attacked by threats that didn't exist. The flaw was never his ability, it was his temperament. Wildside thrived on chaos. He was impulsive, anarchic, and unpredictable, treating missions less like strategic assignments and more like opportunities to create carnage. Weapon X handlers couldn't trust him to follow orders. While his hallucinations were devastating, he often deployed them at the wrong time or against the wrong targets, sometimes confusing allies in the middle of critical operations. Instead of a scalpel that disrupted opponents with precision, Wildside became a grenade tossed into the middle of everything. His behavior turned him from a weapon of psychological warfare into a liability that endangered every team he worked with. This wasn't a case of science failing to produce results. Wildside's mutant gift was fully functional. The failure came from Weapon X's belief that raw power could make up for instability. They could not impose discipline, and without discipline, his abilities lost their value. In practice, they had engineered nothing more than an agent of chaos who undercut their goals more often than he advanced them. Slayback. Already a mercenary with a violent streak, he was rebuilt into a cybernetic powerhouse. His body was packed with advanced tech, granting him superhuman durability, enhanced reflexes, and regenerative systems that made him almost impossible to put down. On the surface, it looked like the program had created another indestructible enforcer who could survive missions that broke ordinary operatives. The science wasn't where things fell apart. Slayback's cybernetics worked, and he was every bit as dangerous as the engineers promised. The problem was what he chose to do with it. Instead of carrying out Weapon X's operations, he leaned fully into his sadistic nature. Missions often devolved into torture sessions, with Slayback dragging out violence long past the point of usefulness. He turned assignments that were meant to be fast and covert into spectacles that exposed the program's hand. The real collapse came when his personal vendettas overshadowed any loyalty to Weapon X. Slayback developed a fixation on Deadpool, hunting him down repeatedly rather than fulfilling the tasks set by the program. Every time he went rogue, the investment Weapon X had poured into his enhancements was wasted. Rather than a soldier executing strategy, they had unleashed a sadist chasing grudges. This was a different shade of failure compared to Wolverine or Saber-tooth. Those were creations who broke free. Slayback's enhancements held, but the mission goals did not. Weapon X succeeded in making him nearly unkillable, yet failed completely in directing his violence toward outcomes that served their agenda. In the end, Slayback became a symbol of how Weapon X confused brutality with effectiveness. They thought making someone stronger, tougher, and harder to kill would guarantee guarantee results. Instead, they amplified a sadist who used their resources to fight personal wars, leaving the program with nothing to show for their investment except another uncontrollable disaster. Mesmero. Weapon X wasn't always about physical upgrades and brutal experiments. Sometimes they looked for powers that could bend minds instead of bones. That's where Mesmero came in. As a mutant hypnotist, he had the ability to control thoughts and influence actions with direct eye contact. In theory, this was exactly the kind of weapon the program needed. An agent who could disarm enemies, turn allies against each other, and make infiltration effortless. No blood, no mess, just domination through suggestion. The science was irrelevant here. Mesmero's powers were innate. Weapon X's role was recruitment and conditioning, but that's where things unraveled. Mesmero had the gift, but not the backbone. His hypnosis could bring people under control, but he was weak-willed, cowardly, and quick to abandon his handlers the moment pressure mounted. Weapon X wanted a master manipulator to bend the battlefield. Instead, they ended up with a pawn who could be manipulated himself. On missions, Mesmero's performance often collapsed at the first sign of resistance. He could control civilians or low-level operatives, but against trained opponents, his focus wavered. Worse, his tendency to panic meant he rarely lasted long enough to change the outcome of an operation. Instead of being a strategic game changer, he became a liability that Weapon X had to protect more than they could use. This was a failure rooted in recruitment. The program bet on a mutant with useful powers, but they underestimated the importance of personality and discipline. Mesmero never had the qualities of a soldier or an operative. The powers worked, the person behind them didn't. For Weapon X, that meant investing time and resources into an asset who never produced results in the field. Washout. Interestingly, Weapon X was also recruiting mutants with unique powers that could be shaped into weapons. One of those recruits was John Lopez, better known as Washout. His mutation gave him control over liquids. He could manipulate water, acids, even the fluids inside a body. On paper, this was an incredible asset. A soldier who could drown enemies on dry land or melt equipment from a distance was exactly the kind of versatility the program wanted. The problem was stability. Washout's abilities were erratic, sometimes surging out of control and other times failing to activate when needed. The more Weapon X tried to refine his mutation, the less reliable he became. He lacked precision, and the experiments designed to amplify his power put even more strain on his body. Instead of unlocking his full potential, the program pushed him closer to collapse. When they finally deployed him, the results spoke for themselves. Missions didn't fall apart because Washout turned against them. He never got that far. His powers simply weren't dependable enough to achieve the objectives. In the field, unpredictability is fatal, and Washout embodied that risk. Eventually, his instability caught up with him. He died young, never proving the grand promises that made Weapon X recruit him in the first place. This was a different kind of failure than Wolverine or Deadpool. Those were successes that spun out of control. Washout was the opposite, a weapon that never reached its full strength. The program invested in him hoping to unlock a game changer, but what they got was a mutant whose potential slipped through their fingers before it could ever reshape the battlefield. Memory implant projects. For years, Weapon X tried to control their creations through memory implants, rewriting entire pasts to keep subjects obedient. The idea was simple. If you can convince someone their life has always belonged to Weapon X, then you never have to worry about loyalty. It was psychological. Engineering layered over biological breakthroughs, a way to create soldiers who wouldn't question orders because their very identities had been manufactured. The system worked at first glance. Subjects woke up with false childhoods, fabricated missions, and loyalty to handlers they believed they had always known. Wolverine became the prime target of these experiments, subjected to endless cycles of altered memories. Family he never had, wars he never fought, betrayals that never happened. Each reset was meant to bury the man beneath the weapon. The collapse came in the long run. Memory implants never lasted, fragments of truth bled through the lies, and subjects started piecing together the inconsistencies. For Wolverine, this meant constant disorientation, flashes of reality breaking through the fiction, and an unrelenting search for the truth. Instead of producing an obedient soldier, Weapon X created an unstable man haunted by questions they could never fully erase. Other operatives exposed to the same process suffered breakdowns, confusion, or outright rebellion once they realized their lives had been scripted. The failure was structural. The technology could rewrite, but it couldn't hold. No matter how many times Weapon X tried to overwrite the past, the truth clawed its way back. Rather than controlling their creations, the implants deepened mistrust and left subjects harder to manage. In Wolverine's case, it gave him more reasons to turn against them. Stryker's Weapon X reboot. Weapon X's legacy of broken soldiers and failed projects should have been enough to bury the program, but years later, it was revived under William Stryker. Unlike the scientists who came before him, Stryker wasn't just chasing science, he was chasing ideology. A religious zealot who believed mutants were abominations, he saw Weapon X as the perfect tool to turn faith into firepower. Under his leadership, the program came back online with new funding, new recruits, and the same obsession with turning mutants into controllable weapons. At first glance, the reboot looked organized. Stryker assembled teams of operatives, restarted the experiments, and doubled down on conditioning. Soldiers like Saber-tooth and others were pulled back into service while new experiments pushed the boundaries of cloning, cybernetics, and mind control. On the surface, it seemed like the mistakes of the past had been replaced with structure. But fanaticism doesn't build loyalty, it breeds instability. Stryker's crusade wasn't about creating effective assets, it was about fulfilling his personal war against mutants. That obsession drove his methods past the breaking point. Recruits turned against their handlers, infighting tore squads apart, and the violence inside the program became as destructive as anything they aimed at their enemies. The deeper Stryker pushed his ideology, the more the program collapsed into betrayal and chaos. The failure here wasn't in the science. The enhancements, cloning, and conditioning often worked. The failure was in the foundation. A program built on religious extremism couldn't sustain itself as a military project. The weapons they created had no loyalty to Stryker's cause, and the very ideology meant to unite them instead drove them to rebel. In the end, Stryker's reboot of Weapon X went the way of every version before it, imploding under its own weight. The difference was scale. This was the entire structure collapsing because it was fueled by fanaticism instead of strategy. Weapon X survived many failures, but under Stryker it became clear the program's biggest weakness was never science at all. It was the people running it. And that's it. Now to you, if you had to decide which Weapon X failure was the most dangerous, the ones who escaped or the ones who collapsed on the battlefield, comment down below. As you leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos like this one.